I need to read the used names file and then write the story. Let me check the names to avoid and craft something completely new. The names to avoid are Walter Brennan, Daniel, Henry, Eleanor, Russell Hobart, Pierce, Tamsin, Birdie, Conrad Whitaker, Patrick, Melissa, Haley, Tom McAllister, Caroline, Garrison, Vivian, Lily, Marcus, Renata, Mrs. Breen, Lily, Marcus, Renata, Mrs. Rowe, Kowalski, Russell, Elliot, Nadine, Theo, George Alderman, Nathan, Sterling, Claire, Frank Dolan, Patricia Arthur, Jim, Doug Mercer, Bradley, Sasha, Diane. Now I'll write the story. 5,000 words. First person. American male 60 plus. New names. Family betrayal revenge theme. Applying the analyzed formula. The morning of my son's rehearsal dinner, I ironed my own shirt. That sounds like a small thing, but I hadn't ironed a shirt in 11 years, not since my wife passed, and I stood there in the bathroom holding the iron over the collar, and I thought, this is what love looks like when nobody's watching. A 63-year-old man, alone in a house too big for one person, making himself presentable for a son who hadn't called him back in 6 days. I told myself he was busy. Grooms are busy. I know how these things go. I pressed the collar flat and hung the shirt on the door and went downstairs to make coffee. His name is Owen. My son. He's 31 now, which still catches me off guard sometimes. I'll be driving somewhere and I'll think about the boy who used to fall asleep on my shoulder at baseball games, and then I'll remember he's 31 with a mortgage and a fiancée and opinions about wine. And the distance between those two versions of him feels like something I can't quite measure. I love him. I want to say that clearly before any of this goes further. I love my son. I just didn't know that morning, ironing my shirt, what he and his fiancée had already set in motion. Her name is Courtney. She came into Owen's life about 4 years ago, and in the beginning I genuinely liked her. Sharp, organized, the kind of woman who sends thank you notes within 24 hours and remembers what you ordered at dinner 2 months ago. Owen lit up around her. That mattered to me. But there were small things. The way she'd redirect conversations about the past, about Owen's mother, about his childhood, about us, with a brightness that felt practiced. The way she started referring to Owen's inheritance, casually, the way you'd refer to the weather, when Owen comes into his father's business, as if that were already decided, as if I'd already signed something I hadn't seen yet. I own a commercial real estate firm, nothing flashy, but solid, built over 32 years out of handshakes and showing up on time and doing what I said I would do. After my wife died, I threw myself back into it. Work kept me from going somewhere dark. The firm kept me here. Owen worked with me for 3 years after college. He was good at it. Not great, but good. Then Courtney came along, and within 18 months he decided he wanted to pursue his own path, which turned out to be a tech startup that burned through $200,000 of his savings in 14 months. I didn't say I told you so. I wrote him a check, and I didn't say a word. That was my first mistake. Not the check, the silence. They announced the engagement at Christmas 2 years ago. I toasted them at the dinner table, and I meant it. I asked what kind of wedding they were thinking. Owen said they wanted something meaningful, but not over the top. Courtney smiled at that. It was a specific kind of smile, the kind that has already done its math. By February, the venue had been booked. A historic inn out in the Hudson Valley, the kind of place that charges you for the cobblestones. I got a call from Owen asking if I was still planning to help with the costs. I said, of course. He said, great, and Courtney would send me a summary. The summary arrived as a spreadsheet, 43-line items. The total at the bottom was $340,000. I sat with that number for a long time. I thought about my wife, who would have wanted Owen happy. I thought about the rehearsal dinner I'd already agreed to host separately, another $18,000. I thought about all the years I'd spent building something so that my son would have a softer landing than I did. I wired the first installment, and I didn't say a word. That was my second mistake. Somewhere around March, about 8 months before the wedding, things started to shift in ways I couldn't name. Owen stopped returning calls same day, then same week. When we did talk, he was pleasant but distant, like a man reading from a script he'd memorized but didn't write. Courtney began handling more of the communication, which I told myself was normal. Brides coordinate, that's how it works. But then my accountant called me. His name is Fred Greer. Been with me 27 years, knows my finances, the way a doctor knows a patient's history. He called on a Tuesday afternoon and said he needed to see me in person, not over the phone. I drove to his office. He closed the door. He put a folder on the desk between us and he didn't say anything for a moment. The folder contained copies of documents, some of them bearing my signature. I didn't recognize 2 of them. One was a limited power of attorney that appeared to grant Owen authority over certain decisions related to the firm during what was described as a period of health-related incapacity. The language was careful, clinical. The signature at the bottom looked like mine. The date was from 6 months prior, right around the time I'd been hospitalized briefly for a cardiac episode. Nothing serious in the end. A warning, the doctors called it. But I'd been in and out of that hospital for 2 days, and there had been paperwork, forms I'd signed without reading carefully, because I was tired and worried, and the nurse said it was routine. The second document was a letter of intent, co-signed by Owen and a woman named Vivian Marsh. I'd never heard of her, expressing interest in acquiring controlling interest in Greer Holdings, which is the parent structure of my firm. In the event of my incapacitation or voluntary transition. Fred looked at me across the desk and said, "I don't think you signed this one knowingly." I looked at the signature again. He was right. The pen pressure was wrong. The loop in the G was wrong. I've signed my name maybe 10,000 times in 30 years, and I know what it looks like. I sat in Fred's office for a long time after that. I didn't call Owen that night. I didn't call anyone. I drove home and I sat in the kitchen where my wife used to make Sunday gravy, and I let myself feel the full weight of what might be happening. Because I'm not a man who panics. I've been through a recession that nearly took everything. I've buried the person I loved most in the world. I've sat across the table from people who wanted to take what I built, and I've come out the other side. But this was my son. I kept circling back to that. This is my son. And underneath the grief, something else was clarifying. Something cold and focused. The part of me that had built a business from scratch over 3 decades. I called my attorney the next morning. His name is Vernon Holt, a man who has seen everything, who speaks slowly on purpose and charges accordingly. I told him what Fred had found. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he said, "Don't move anything, don't change anything, and don't let on that you know." I said, "For how long?" he said, "Until the wedding." Here is what Vernon and Fred uncovered over the next 7 months, working carefully, leaving no fingerprints. Courtney's family had connections to a private equity group. Small, not well known, but aggressive. Vivian Marsh was a principal there. The plan, as best as we could reconstruct it, was layered. First, establish a paper trail suggesting I had agreed, in principle, to transition the firm to Owen's management. Second, use the forged letter of intent to create leverage, not necessarily in court, but in the messier arena of business relationships, where perception can do real damage. Third, accelerate that timeline if my health provided an opening. The cardiac episode had been that opening. Someone, and I believe I know who, had advised Owen that this was the moment, that I was vulnerable. That paperwork filed during a hospitalization carries less scrutiny. Owen didn't forge the signature himself. I don't think he had the nerve for that. But I believe he knew the documents existed, and he said nothing. And in the eyes of the law, that is not an innocent position. Vernon said we had enough, that we could move immediately, freeze accounts, file injunctions, begin the process of having the forged documents formally examined. I said, "Wait." He looked at me. I said, "The rehearsal dinner is in 6 weeks, the wedding is in 8. I want to do this right." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Tell me what right looks like." I should say something about the rehearsal dinner because it matters to what came next. I hosted it at a private room in a restaurant I've been going to for 20 years. I paid for everything: the food, the wine, the flowers, the little menus they printed with Owen and Courtney's names on them. I sat at the head of the table and I gave a toast. I talked about Owen as a boy, about the time he was 9 years old and he rebuilt a broken radio from parts he found in the garage, and how I thought then that he had his mother's patience and her precision. I said I was proud of the man he'd become. I kept my voice level. Courtney watched me the whole time I spoke. She was smiling, but it was that same smile, the one with the math already done. And I thought, she thinks this is almost over. Owen hugged me at the end of the night. He smelled like his grandfather's aftershave, an Old Spice thing that had somehow passed down genetically. And for a moment I held on longer than I should have, because part of me still hoped I'd gotten it wrong. I hadn't gotten it wrong. The wedding was on a Saturday in October, up at the inn, the kind of New England fall day that looks like a postcard. Maples going red and orange, stone walls, blue sky with no clouds in it. The inn had a main hall and a terrace and a garden where the ceremony would be held. It had cost, if I tallied every invoice, approximately $388,000 of my money. I arrived early. I was, after all, the father of the groom. Vernon had handled the logistical pieces that week. Certain accounts had been restructured, certain documents had been notarized and filed in places that could not be reached quickly. A forensic accountant had submitted a formal report regarding the signatures. And 2 individuals from the county DA's office were familiar with the situation, though not yet formally involved. They were waiting for one more thing. I also had a conversation the Tuesday before the wedding with the inn's audiovisual coordinator. A young man named Pete, very professional, very discreet. I explained what I needed. He said he could do it. I tipped him very well. The ceremony was at 4 o'clock. I watched my son get married. I sat in the front row in my good suit, and I watched him stand up there and say his vows to a woman who had spent the better part of 2 years engineering a document that bore my forged signature. And I kept my face exactly right because I am 63 years old and I've had decades of practice keeping my face exactly right. Courtney was beautiful, I'll say that. The dress, the flowers, she'd put real care into the aesthetics of the thing. When they kissed and everyone applauded, I clapped too. During cocktail hour, I circulated. I talked to Courtney's parents. Her father is a man named Bud who sells insurance and plays too much golf. A perfectly decent man who I don't believe knew what his daughter had done. I talked to Owen's college friends who called me Mr. Calloway and asked about the firm. I had a glass of sparkling water and I watched the light go orange over the valley. Vivian Marsh was there. I'd found her face in photographs online, so I knew her when I saw her. A composed woman in her 50s in a grey dress, standing near the bar, talking to Courtney's maid of honor. She didn't know what I looked like. Or if she did, she didn't know I knew who she was. At one point, she was standing about 10 feet from me, and I watched her check her phone and smile at something. And I thought about my 32 years, and I was fine. Dinner was at 7. Speeches were scheduled for 8:15. At 8 o'clock, I excused myself from the table and found Pete near the AV cabinet at the back of the hall. He handed me a small wireless remote and pointed to the 3 buttons. I thanked him and put it in my jacket pocket. I returned to my seat. At 8:14, Courtney's brother gave a toast that was mostly about Courtney and went about 4 minutes. Then Owen's best man went. A friend named Graham who'd known Owen since Little League. A good man, a genuinely good toast, the kind that made the room laugh and then go quiet at the right moment. I was glad Graham was in Owen's life. Then the MC said, "And now, the father of the groom." I stood up. I carried my glass to the front of the room and I looked out at the 212 people who had come to celebrate my son's marriage, and I took a breath. "I want to start," I said, "by saying that today has been one of the most clarifying days of my life." That wasn't the word they expected. You could feel it, a small shift in the room, the way an audience leans slightly forward when something is slightly off. "I've been a father for 31 years, I continued, and anyone who's been a parent knows that the job comes with no instruction manual. You make decisions and you hope they're right, and sometimes you find out they weren't, and you live with that. I've made mistakes. I've been too generous when I should have been more careful. I've confused giving with loving, and I've signed things I should have read more carefully." Owen was looking at me. Something had changed in his face. "I want to tell you all something," I said, "about what it means to build something. Not just a business, but a family. A name. A reputation that takes 30 years to establish and about 45 seconds to damage. I know that because I almost lost mine this year." The room was very quiet. "I had a health scare last year. Nothing I couldn't come back from, but for a couple of days I was in a hospital bed and I was tired and I wasn't as careful as I should have been about what I put my name to." I paused. As it turns out, some other people weren't careful about what they put my name to either. I reached into my jacket pocket, not for the remote yet, but for the folded piece of paper Vernon had given me to hold. I didn't open it. I just held it. I have spent the last 7 months working with my attorney and my accountant to understand the full picture of what was being planned. And I want to be honest with you all, because honesty is what I was raised on, and it's what I try to raise my son on. I looked at Owen. His face was the color of chalk. The picture is not a good one. Courtney started to rise from her seat. I pressed the first button on the remote in my pocket. The main lights in the hall dimmed. The projection screen at the far end of the room, the one that had been showing their engagement photos during dinner, changed. Pete had queued it up for me. On the screen now were 2 documents, side by side, enlarged and clearly legible, the limited power of attorney and the letter of intent, both with my name on them. "These are documents that were filed earlier this year," I said calmly, purportedly bearing my signature. I did not knowingly sign either of them. The second one, the letter of intent to acquire my company, has been examined by a forensic document specialist whose report is now part of an official record. The room had gone the kind of silent where you can hear people breathing. Vivian Marsh was no longer near the bar. I didn't look for her. It didn't matter. "I'm not going to spend the rest of this evening on the details," I said. "The details are being handled by people whose job it is to handle them. What I want to say, the thing I really came up here to say, is this." I put down my glass. I wasn't going to toast. Owen. He was still staring at me. His eyes were bright in a way I hadn't seen since he was a teenager. "I love you. That is a fact that none of this changes. But love is not a blank check. And I spent too many years confusing those two things. Whatever happens next, legally, financially, personally, I want you to know that I spent 32 years building something because I believed in it, not for you, not to hand it over. Because I believed in the work, and no piece of paper, signed or forged or otherwise, changes what belongs to whom." I straightened my jacket. "To the rest of you, thank you for coming. The food was excellent. The venue is beautiful. I hope you enjoy the rest of your evening." I set the remote on the nearest table and I walked to the back of the hall and I got my coat and I walked out into the October night. The drive home is about 2 hours. I stopped once at a gas station just past Poughkeepsie, and I got a coffee from the machine, and I stood in the parking lot under the fluorescent lights, and I let the feeling move through me. It wasn't triumph. I want to be clear about that. It wasn't satisfaction in any clean sense. It was more like what happens when you've been carrying something very heavy for a very long time, and you finally set it down. Not because you found somewhere good to put it, but because your arms gave out, and you had to. I drove the rest of the way home. I'll tell you what happened in the weeks that followed, because I know that's what you're wondering. The forensic report was enough. The signature on the letter of intent was ruled, formally, to be a forgery. Vivienne Marsh's firm came under investigation. One of her associates, a younger man who had apparently been the one to actually produce the document, cooperated with investigators in exchange for a reduced charge. He identified the chain of communication. It went where I thought it went. Courtney retained an attorney, a good one, unfortunately. She maintained that she had no direct knowledge of the forged document, that she had merely introduced Owen to Vivienne Marsh as a potential business contact. Whether that holds up will be for other people to decide. As of the last time Vernon updated me, the matter is still moving through the system the way these things do. Slowly, with a great deal of paperwork. Vivienne Marsh's firm lost 2 major clients within a month of the story becoming known in certain circles. That's how it works in commercial real estate. Reputation is the whole game. The firm is mine. It will remain mine until I decide otherwise, and when I decide otherwise, I will do so with my eyes open and my attorney present and my own hand on the pen. Owen called me on a Wednesday, 3 weeks after the wedding. I let it ring twice before I picked up. Not because I was playing games, because I needed 2 rings to decide what kind of man I wanted to be in that conversation. "Dad," he said, "own." There was a long silence, the kind that has weight to it. "I didn't know about the signature," he said finally. "I need you to know that." I believed him. Partially. The truth, I think, is that he knew enough and chose not to know the rest, which is its own kind of choice, and not an innocent one, but also not the same thing as forgery. I've thought about this a lot. I probably think about it for the rest of my life. "I know you didn't sign it," I said. "That's been established. I mean, I didn't know that anyone, Owen." I said it quietly. "What did you think was happening when they brought you those first documents? The power of attorney. What did you think that was?" Silence. "I thought it was just protective," he said, "in case something happened to you." "In case something happened to me," I repeated, "and you didn't think to mention it to me." He didn't have an answer for that. I told him I wasn't ready to have the bigger conversation yet, that I needed time, and he needed to be honest with himself before we could be honest with each other. He said he understood. He said he was sorry. He said it the way people say it when they mean it, but also know it doesn't fix anything. I said, "I know." We hung up. I sat in the kitchen. The house felt very large. It usually does. People ask me sometimes, well, not people, but I imagine people asking whether I regret how I handled the wedding, whether I should have done it differently. Privately, maybe. Legal channels only, no public moment, no speech, and I'll be honest, I've turned that question over many times. Here's what I keep coming back to. The speech wasn't about punishment. I'm not built for punishment. That's a cold man's game, and I've never been cold, even when I've had to be hard. The speech was about honesty. In a room full of people who had come to witness something, I wanted to tell the truth about what had happened and what building something means and what love is not. My wife would have told me to stay home. She'd have said let the lawyers handle it and don't give them the satisfaction of your emotion. She was smarter than me about most things, but she's not here. And this is my story to live, not hers. Here is what I know now that I didn't know 18 months ago. Generosity is not the same as love. Giving someone everything they want is not the same as preparing them for a world that will not give them everything they want. I handed my son a softness that I thought was protection, and what it turned out to be was a gap in his foundation, and other people found that gap before I did. That's on me. Not entirely, but enough. I'll carry that. I also know that a man who built something with his hands, real work, real years, real early mornings and late nights and phone calls he didn't want to take, doesn't have to apologize for protecting what he built. Not to anyone, not even to his son. The firm is doing well. We brought on 2 new clients in November. Fred and I restructured the ownership documentation so that everything is airtight going forward. A revocable trust, clear succession provisions, all of it reviewed by 2 separate attorneys. Vernon says it's the cleanest he's seen. I still iron my own shirts. I'm still in a house that's too big for one person. Some evenings I sit on the back porch and I watch the yard go dark. And I think about the boy with the radio and the woman who had his patients and the 32 years I spent building something that nobody can take. Not without my name on it. My real name. If you've listened to all of this, I want to say thank you. Not just for your time, for your presence. I've learned at 63 that the worst part of something like this isn't the betrayal. It's the silence afterward. The way you sit with it alone because there's nobody in the house to hand you a cup of coffee and say you did the right thing. So if you're someone who has ever written your own blank checks, financially, emotionally, in any currency, and wondered afterward where the return was, I see you. I understand that math, and I want you to know that it's not too late to change the terms. You built what you built. It belongs to you. Don't let anyone convince you to sign it away in a hospital bed or at a rehearsal dinner or in any other moment when you're tired and you just want the people you love to be happy. They can be happy, but not at the cost of what you are. That's the thing I wish someone had told me. That's the thing I'm telling you now. I've had a lot of time to think about cause and effect since that October night. Not in any grand philosophical sense. I'm not that kind of man. I think about it the way a contractor thinks about a foundation crack. You trace it back. You find where the settling started. You ask yourself what you could have done differently before the whole wall shifted. The crack started with me. I know that now. Not with Owen, not with Courtney, not with Vivian Marsh and her carefully worded letters of intent. It started the first time I wrote a check without a conversation. The first time I said yes, because it was easier than saying, let's talk about this. I spent 32 years teaching my son, without meaning to, that love arrives in the form of a wire transfer. That's not a lesson I meant to give him. But intent doesn't change what was received. Owen made his own choices. I want to be honest about that too, because it would be easier and smaller to make him purely a victim of Courtney's ambition. He's not. He's a man who knew enough and chose to look the other way, and that is its own kind of decision. The people who take what isn't theirs rarely do it entirely alone. They need someone nearby who will stay quiet. Owen stayed quiet. He'll carry that. So will I. What I've come to understand, and this took me longer than it should have, sitting alone in that big house, is that character doesn't announce itself in the good years. It shows up in the moments when something is at stake and nobody's watching. Courtney's character showed up in a forged signature. Owen showed up in his silence. And mine showed up, I think, in what I chose to do with 7 months of knowing the truth. Not destruction, not revenge, but precision. Preparation. Waiting for the right moment to be honest in front of people who deserve the truth. That's what I mean by intelligence mattering. Not cleverness. I've known clever people who ran themselves into the ground. I mean the kind of thinking that asks what actually serves justice here rather than what feels good right now. Standing up at that reception wasn't an emotional decision. It was a considered one. I'd thought about it from every angle. I knew what I was doing and why. That discipline, holding the impulse and examining it before acting, is something I learned at 63 the hard way. I wish I'd learned it at 30. And the resilience piece. That's the one people underestimate. It's not toughness. Toughness is just rigidity with better branding. Resilience is the ability to absorb a real loss, a real betrayal by someone you would have walked through fire for, and still get up the next morning and iron your own shirt and drive 2 hours home in the dark and wake up and call your attorney and keep going. It's not dramatic. It doesn't look like anything from the outside. It's just continuing one day after the next without letting the wound become your identity. I'm still in that house, still running the firm. Fred and I had lunch last week. Vernon sends me updates when there's something worth updating. Owen called again last month. We talked for 40 minutes. It was hard and honest and unresolved, the way real things usually are. I don't know yet what we'll be to each other going forward, but I know what I am. That part didn't change. You build something over 32 years, you learn what it's made of. Turns out, so do you.